We'll have a transcript battle because the Zoom recording also transcripts off to the side. So we'll see which one captures our acronyms more accurately. And welcome to everybody joining us. We'll get started in just a moment, give you a chance to get your audio locked in and get yourself settled in. All right, so I'll make sure that I type all this out for anybody that joins us a little bit later, but welcome to today's webinar, or coffee break, I should say. To start with, this is Zoom webinar rather than Zoom meeting, so your cameras and microphones are disabled by default, so you don't need to worry about interrupting us, but that does mean for interaction, you're limited to chat. And there's two kind of text inputs you can use. You can use the chat functionality, if you have a general comment or if you want to have a discussion, that's a great place for it. Just make sure that you select all panelists and attendees in the drop down there. Otherwise, only we will see your comment. If you have a question for any of the panelists specifically or just in general, please use the Q&A feature. It'll be much easier for us to manage questions if you put that in there. You can view all the questions that have been asked already. You can ask them anonymously and you can upvote and comment on them yourself. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Tom Green, our moderator.
Great. Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. So glad you can join us today for this coffee break. I'm really pleased to have with me today the authors of an exciting new book, perfectly timed for the times we are living in, Holistic Admissions, Predicting the Likelihood for Student Success. So today, what we'd like to do, and you can see the presenters here, I'll be introducing them as they speak throughout the panel, is to go ahead and really kind of recapture some of the highlights of this book and present them to you. I'd encourage you to dive in a little bit deeper. You can find this on the Acro bookshelf and online, and we'll also have a slide on this at the end of the seminar today. So we want to talk a little bit about what in the world we mean by holistic when we say holistic admission. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about the groundbreaking work of Dr. William Sedlacek and on non-cognitive variables and how those are used in this approach to holistic admission. And then we're going to hear from four practitioners, four colleges and universities in North America that have implemented this method. And they're going to talk a little bit about their experience going through the implementation and use of this at each of their institutions. So without further ado, let's dive in. We find ourselves in a time where lots of colleges and universities have implemented what they've determined to be or labeled holistic admission. But what does that really mean? It really is a blanket that gets thrown over a lot of different practices, and it's not new. Holistic as a concept of looking beyond merely the quantitative aspects of an applicant's background is something that goes back hundreds of years. And so we've seen it in different practices where there might be interviews, there might be essays, et cetera, things that might be potential practices for it. When we find it applied today in this new context with it, there are a few things that we really want to pay attention to. And one of those, of course, is that is there real consistency in the methods that are applied here? And the answer is unfortunately no when we look at the landscape of what's being practiced today. Because we don't really find that there is any consistency that a student could predict what holistic admission might be at a college or university, or if they're applying to two or three different ones, there may be two or three very different practices that are called holistic admission across those. But we also need to be very cognizant that when we take away a rigorous process and objectivity, the ability to be somewhat objective in looking at students with this, we also open ourselves up to increasing bias. And that is something that we need to be very wary of as we see this real rush to implement what people are calling holistic methods. We need to pay attention to this because really good practice means that you are making consistent decisions, that you have a way of evaluating how you are gauging what is termed to be holistic practice and admissions, and that there's some kind of a rubric or some way in which you're scoring towards certain outcomes that you're looking for from that practice. Unfortunately, we see far too little of that happening, and a lot of things being implemented like essays or interviews, resumes, and portfolios without the kind of rigor, the research behind it, the application of consistent methods that could open up this process to actually increasing bias in the process, not decreasing it, which, if I'm not mistaken, was part of the point of people going to holistic admission. They were trying to get away from potential disadvantages in doing just simply quantitative analysis of an applicant's background. So just to kind of set the stage with that and talk a little bit about this term holistic, we really want to focus in a little bit more on what are good practices in holistic admission. And we want to go even more specifically towards that of the use of non-cognitive variables. So I'm going to ask one of the book's main authors, Michelle Sandlin, if she would speak next to these parts of the slide. Michelle?
Great. All right. Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for being with us today. When we're talking about non-cognitive variables, a term coined by Dr. Sedlicek, we're talking more about in the life skills areas. If any of you have done research on this and saw some of the terminology that was defined in the playbook by the College Board and Educational Council, they talked about geography and socioeconomic status as other means of holistic admissions. But the bulk of the work has been in the life skills area, and that's what the non-cognitive variables are focused on. Here are four main definitions that on holistic admissions, and specifically on the work that Dr. Sedlicek has done. Focus on what's been put in bold and underlined. The first definition is by actually Dr. Sedlicek. You're going to hear from him in just a quick second. But these are variables that relate to adjustment, motivation, and student perceptions, which he has a lot of research that shows that students that do well in these variables most often are very successful when they get to college. This emphasis on the whole person, that's where the term holistic comes from, that admit interesting students who contribute to the campus community in meaningful ways. That has been a big part of this. And particularly, I would say since COVID, there has been a huge resurgence in interest. Part of that has to do with the testing options going away, are not being able to happen, and Black Lives Matter as well. Qualities that reward determination, hard work, students that can set long-term goals and have done that in the past and achieved them, that is a very strong variable. And we're looking at the components that are comprehensive, they're fair, and they're an impartial measure for students' likelihood for success. Tom kind of mentioned this earlier, the whole bias piece plays into this, but the process that we have worked on with ACRA, with Dr. Sedlicek over the last 14, 15 years, puts a pretty objective model on top of what could be a subjective process. Tom, back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. William Sedlicek, whose work in this area has been the basis for groundbreaking work in the use of non-cognitive variables in admission, scholarship, placement, etc. So nice to have you with us today, Sed, and please take it away.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. And with our various COVID issues going on right now, probably we're in for a big change in how we deliver education. Perhaps this will influence us for decades. And I think what we're discussing here today will help us in any kind of movement away from the traditional. But what I've tried to do in this book mentioned here, and in one that I think is also noted in another slide, that we needed to take a new look at assessment. If you just went with the typical grades and test scores, you would be missing a lot. We wanted something that was more practical, a real acro sort of thing, because rather than just a lot of talk about what to do, what would we actually do? How would we implement it? What are the practical things we need to do? And so I think the work that I've done in this book and in the other writings are practical. So they're aimed at something you can actually use and plug in. And I might say that they are also free, basically. You can go to my website and pick up hundreds of articles and examples of how to do this or that, all the different formats you might use, everything from interviews to multiple choice sorts of items, essays, and so forth. And so the idea is, what do you do with the issues that you have? What do you do with the methods, not just that you use them? The theory comes in the sense of, why should this stuff work? I've tried to aim my work at lots of different audiences, and there are some people who would be skeptical. Say, take faculty members. Why should this stuff work? Why the heck should we use this? And so I think the logic of these assessments is there. And basically it's that there's more to life than just verbal and quantitative scores or abilities, as we know we get from tests. All of us know this in our lives. We know that a person is a lot more than that. So we really need to get into personality theories and all kinds of other ways to assess human attributes. And then also be able to score those in some way, to use them, to quantify them, so it isn't just nice talk. You know, every college catalog says all these great things about how everyone's wonderful at that particular place. But what I try to do in the writings and what we're talking about here is to make that practical. What do you mean by that, and how do you measure it? Success related. This is an interesting one, because if you're a typical faculty member, let's say at a large university, you have to do research to get promoted. And somebody who says, hey, this is a great area to study, we'll gather the data now, then we'll wait, 6, 8 years and find out what happened to the students. You're probably not going to be around long enough to see what happened to the results that you have. So I think we've not encouraged long-term research that's related to both not only grades, but success outcomes, jobs that people get, graduate school, all kinds of other things. And I might mention that the work is available for all kinds of different students, institutions, small colleges, community colleges, medical schools, law schools, graduate schools, highly selective schools. So I've tried to do it so that this stuff is worth taking a look at, regardless of where you are in the system somewhere. And you can also take credit for it. I've had more than one person come up to me and say, we've been using your stuff out here at school X, but we forgot where we got it from. And so I guess that's fine, but you can look smart and look good by just picking up this stuff, which is available really at no cost if you look at these various writings. Student development. One of the traps of admissions is that, okay, we got all these students, we sort of dump them into the system, and then it's up to somebody else to worry about what to do with them. Well, I think these non-cognitive variables suggest what to develop a student on. Nobody's perfect on everything, and so you get a profile. You can work closely with everyone from the admissions folks to all the different advisors and so forth that you might have in the school. Also, all the different ones that may be jealous of one another. You can provide a way to connect all the different places that help students. And so I think it fits that very nicely. Fairness and legality. We want something that's fair to everybody. One of the things we see a lot now with our current politics is that, hey, you're being fair to these guys, but not to me and my people. And so there's a lot of anger. So these are methods that you can use for everybody. And everyone has a stake in them in one way or another. And you can fill out a profile for somebody and have a full range of abilities. So it's a good way to say, if you've got some potential, something that you haven't been able to present well, or if you're a parent, your kid has probably got some abilities that maybe you recognize, but nobody else does, and so forth. So it's kind of fair for everybody. And I hope that you will look at the work and judge that. Legality, something that a lot of us are worried about. Will we get sued? Is this stuff fair across different groups and so forth? And there are some test cases that suggest that particularly if you have this research behind it and you have somebody like ACRO supporting it, that it is legal to go ahead and use these dimensions and have a way to fight off a lawsuit or really discourage one to begin with. Broad literature, if you look at the publications, they're really in hundreds of different journals and all sorts of different specialties. One of the other problems we have in our business is people just publish in just a few places that they're familiar with if they only look at their own journals. But I've seen publications that I've published in all kinds of different types of journals, higher ed journals, journals that have to do with foreign language, international journals, you name it, they're out there. So that also means that you can probably find something related to your work in one or more of these areas and then expand the concept of it so that you can talk to your colleagues about it. So I guess we're ready for the next slide then. So here's a list of the variables. I'll just go down them very briefly. But again, we can operationally define these. We have ways to measure them. They're examples. And so I will just briefly go over them to give you the feel for it. But again, you can look at all the writings about them. A positive self-concept. This is maybe an obvious thing, but if somebody's starting school and they don't really feel like there's going to be such a good student, or this maybe isn't a place for them or something, you've got a sense of failure beforehand. Simple idea, psychologists have been studying this forever, and that is if you feel good about yourself, you're more likely to give yourself a break and get off to a good start, which is what we want. The second part of this is realistic self-appraisal. You've got to know what you're good at and what you're not so good at. And a lot of students don't do well on this. It's surprising. I've had many students that say, gee, I don't think I'm going to be so good at this or that, but they've never really taken a good look at what their strengths and weaknesses are. So you'll actually get a score on the various measures that I have in my writing. So you can then give yourself a way to work with that student and say, hey, here's something we can work on. You said you weren't so good at this. Well, let's build it up. Or maybe you're better than you think. Now, here's a tricky one, understands and deals with racism. There's a lot in the news about this. We see the word. I've written a lot about this topic, but basically what we mean is that there are structural things in our system, in the world system, certainly in the education system, and in this case, in the admission system, that work better for some groups than others without intention, but just a priori. If you use grades and test scores, even with the best of intentions, you will be discriminating against lots of groups because they don't show up so well on those. The measures weren't designed for them. But if you add the non-cognitive variables in, you'll be able to go ahead and use the SATs and the GREs and so forth and grades, but realize that there's a lot more that we need to work with, and you can reduce the racism that we have by being more fair to lots of groups that just don't show well on the measures, and they don't show well because they have other potentials they're showing in other ways that they've gotten used to presenting. Long-range goals, an interesting one in that for most of the traditional students we have, upper middle class folks, their parents, their relatives have probably been suggesting that they would go to school when they got out of high school, that they would go to college, etc. And so they're talking about things like this, going back to their place where they went to school. But for a lot of people, the idea of having some goal in life that is longer than just today or next week or whatever, let alone 4 years from now, is not something that they're used to. And the shorter term goals you have, the less likely you are to make it through our various systems. And so you can help a student develop goals, even if they're non-academic goals, but just the idea that you need to set a plan for next week, next month, next year, and then evaluate it and see how you did. A strong support person. Loners have difficulty. People that come from families maybe that don't have the support automatically or aren't used to going to the counseling center We have a bias for lots of groups to say, well, you should never go and admit that you have problems to somebody. That's advice that some parents give their kids. But it's good to have somebody that you can turn to when the going gets tough, and the successful students tend to have an individual, can be on the campus, can be in their family, somewhere, perhaps in their community, but somebody who can kind of push them back in the system as an individual, and not just letting the person fall through the cracks. Leadership, there are tons of writings and studies on leaders and what it is, leadership. It's a big area for psychologists to study. But here we're talking about maybe leadership in less typical circumstances. Just as a quick example, there are some interesting studies on street gang leaders. They make very good students when they translate that potential into higher education. But very few folks are going to write that down in their college application that they led such and such gang for such and such years. But tapping that and making it okay to describe their life and the kinds of things they've done, very important to be able to draw that out. And that can certainly be done with interviews and, again, some of the paper and pencil things. Community supports the idea that loners have trouble. You need a community of some kind, whether it's based on similar cultural things, geography, some kind of identification. So dumping a student into a system and just say, go find something is tough. Helping them hook up with some kind of community, even if it's off campus, very important. The last thing here is how we acquire knowledge. We have learned, all of us have learned all kinds of things outside the education system, and we need to try to tap that and figure out what the student may have picked up about life, about all kinds of odd things. Athletics, teach them all sorts of things. And so being willing to explore that and realize that if you do that, the student probably has learned some stuff, and that you can then build on that and suggest that maybe that could be a good student. And that's just a kind of a quick rundown. And I encourage you to take a look at some of those writings, which go into great detail on how you operationalize this stuff and measure each of these.
Thanks, Ed. That was perfect. And now I'd like Michelle to come back in and talk a little bit about that implementation and ACRO's methodology for it. Michelle?
Great, thank you, Tom. So as I said, ACRO has partnered with Dr. Sedlicek for about 14 years now on pulling in all of his research, the legal ramifications of doing this, and how to do it in a way that can meet all those criteria, but also be manageable on a campus and make it efficient and within reason to do. In the work that I've done for the last 18 years since I've been involved in this area, you'll see there that there's three big components that need to be included in any approach that you go with. ACRO has adopted this approach, and this is part of our holistic methodology, that we're using questions, measures, variables that have been legally tested, as Dr. Sedlicek said, that have been at the Supreme Court. There's been 4 or 5 cases that have been tested at the Supreme Court, reinforced by Dr. Sedlicek's research. And really important, it has to support the mission of the institution. You also see that appear in a lot of educational council's writings on holistic, as the #1 place you start is with the mission of the institution, so that you have questions, measures, and variables. The second thing is having a validated scoring rubric that is calibrated to those questions, measures, variables, whatever you're using, and the same criteria, research, based on research, legally tested. I find when I work with institutions, that's one thing that's always missing, is there is not a scoring rubric. That's probably the biggest missing piece that we find when we work with institutions. And it's a pretty vital piece to be missing. A lot of schools will have questions out there and then they get the results in, and then they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And then third is the formal training. And this was actually supported by the University of Michigan lawsuits, where the Chief Justice Anthony Kennedy, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy specifically stated that you need to have formal training in this process. And it's got to include not only how do you read and score these, but you've got to have reader reliability measures built in, bias awareness that was already mentioned, Tom already mentioned in the beginning. Strongly recommend cultural competency training. And then we included train the trainer. We don't want you dependent on APRA. We want you to own this and take it on yourself. So that's a summary of the implementation process. Back to you, Tom.
That's great, Michelle. And now we get to hear from the first of our 4 institutions that has implemented these. And it's my pleasure to have Dr. Connie Tings from Madonna University to talk about their implementation. Dr. Gattuso?
Thanks, Tom. Hope all of you can hear me. I'm delighted to be with all of you. It's afternoon here, depending on where you are in the country, but it's an incredible day. A little bit about ourselves at Madonna University. We're located in Metro Detroit, Michigan, and we're a mid-sized institution, private Catholic university with about 3,000 students. And the majority of our students are first generation, about 97% of them are receiving federal financial aid, and about 20% are students of color. And we're listed as the most affordable private college in Michigan. If I could go to the next slide. A little bit about overview. I was first exposed to the non-cognitive variables about 18 years ago with the Gates Millennium Scholarship Program. And much to what Dr. Sedlicek was referring to in terms of the seamless connection after admissions, after the point where admissions has made decisions, they've used the rubric that's been available to determine who's most likely predictors of success. Me and others in the area of student affairs and other higher ed professionals have built a plan around these non-cognitive variables to really, one, give students the language to articulate this experience, how they're developing skills, but two, how to help professionals on the other side in terms of programming and service delivery. So as you can see, we have looked at the state of Michigan in terms of Department of Education, and they indicated about 63% of the students, right, are college ready. And so we were fortunate several years ago to build on a Strengthening Institutions Title III grant, which I know many of you have access to try to really focus on retention, persistence, and graduation. From there, we built a student success campaign, educating students about how to translate those non-cognitive variables into skills, and then being able to create visuals for them to see what programming was available for them on campus throughout their college experience that aligns to how are you developing long-term skills, how are you developing leadership. And there's so many areas within higher ed experiences, whether it's athletics, whether it's performing arts, whether it's in student leadership, organizations, and you can imagine covering the gamut, tutoring and being tutors and mentors, and how those skills are being developed. So we were able to focus on a holistic student engagement model to really start to work to use, we've utilized Presence, which many of you may use, and other tools to really track their co-curricular experience, how, to what degree they're engaged, what are they involved in, and then really produce almost a co-curricular transcript that helps them really codify all their experiences throughout their college career. This has helped us in terms of being able to give them language so that when they're talking to employers, they're able to articulate that very clearly. And the other key is really engagement beyond college. When they graduate, they come back as engaged alum, they see the value of it, they really want to invest in creating experiences for other students down the road. Could I go to the next slide? Some of the challenges we encountered realistically, which like many of you, really the programmatic quality during and participation during COVID. So much of this is virtual now. We would have had on-ground high ropes experiences. We would have had on-ground leadership development trainings, and being able to adjust has really affected the connection sometimes in that students have had. Needless to say, we've worked really hard to try to engage continuously, but we've also gone through some organizational restructure, which is pretty common. That campaign really required us to try to be more intentional about how areas across the entire university came to understand the campaign and what role they played in it. Staff turnover, impacting continuity when staff are turning over. You've got folks that are committed, they're building, and they know they won't see the fruits of their labor in terms of investment in students 3-4 years down the line. So if we're seeing turnover, sometimes that's also been much of a challenge in terms of continuity. And then social media, so much competition. They are inundated to the nth power of information. And I know this seems like a common message across the gamut, but how do we stand out in terms of that engagement? How do we compete with all the wonderful offerings that they have in social media too? And then the technological advances, you know, the information overload. I think that's been very real for us, but yet still we've been able to make sure that from orientation, from the moment they're in admissions to orientation to their first year experience and on, that these non-cognitive skills are translated in their language in terms of what they can do. They're more action steps of what they can do. And if I can go to the next slide. These are the outcomes. This is what I was referring to in terms of how the students are translating it. We've worked with Presence on crafting these learning outcomes. By the time they graduate, we've actually seen some students utilize this, share this in their portfolios when they're talking to employers, how they've developed the civic responsibility. Most recently, many of them were organizing on voting and how they were getting their colleagues and their peers in terms of getting engaged, volunteering in different ways, which is the service component, service to community, which is one of the non-cogs. So many of these ways translated, coupled with our other learning goals in accreditation, institutional accreditation, have really kind of helped not only us to know how we're engaging the student, but helping the student know why we're engaging them in what they need to do in terms of their role of growth. On the left side, I just want to share some of our highlights. We were really fortunate. I won't read to you, but several years ago, we received a Noel Levitz Noel Levitz Award for our Black Male Initiative. At one point, we were experiencing a 13% retention rate, and within a couple of years, got to 100% retention. It really stood out, and they were completely focused on the non-cognitive skill development. So we've seen pockets of it with different populations. We are now recalibrating again as we are rolling out a new university strategic plan. But again, it focuses on persistence and graduation. But I think what's really different here is that it's not only from the university standpoint of what we're doing, but it's from the student standpoint, what they can do to move themselves along that continuum. That's it.
That's excellent. And I just want to point out that so many people are looking for what works, especially when we talk about equity gaps between students who are graduating, not graduating. Black men are one of the groups that have the largest equity gap in the United States. And so great to hear that you've had such success in that area. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of people asking you how you did it. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We want to go on now, and we really have different types of institutions represented in this book and with us today. And I'm so pleased to have Catherine Verkerk from Simon Fraser University up in British Columbia to be with us, because this is not just something that works only in the United States. It can equally work well in other countries and other universities. Catherine?
Thanks, Tom. Just want to go to the next slide. So thank you for the opportunity to present today. I just want to, of course, Canadians, say thank you. I'm happy to represent Canadian admissions and also to be part of this group, or to be part of this book with my American colleagues. So thank you very much. For those of you that might not be familiar with Simon Fraser University, we are located in Metro Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. We're a public research university with 3 urban campuses in Burnaby, Surrey, and Vancouver, if you're familiar with the Lower Mainland. We're considered mid-sized in Canada at 30,000 students, which I appreciate could be considered large for my American colleagues. We do have undergraduate, graduate programming. Admission is competitive, so primarily based on admission averages or scores. And for Canadian applicants, we don't use test scores. Next slide, please. So SFU has been doing broad-based admission for a number of years, specifically in our BD School of Business. So this isn't our first foray into holistic admissions, but we completed a detailed review of our admission model in 2016 because the British Columbia provincial school curriculum was changing. Specifically, all the high school courses were changed. So for example, English 12 changed to English Studies. History 12 changed into 6 different history courses, if you can believe it, focused on many different subject areas. And so in this review, we actually considered moving towards holistic admission for all undergraduate programs. So we spent a year researching holistic admission and other admission models. But for us, after all of our research, we decided to implement holistic admissions only for highly competitive programs where we needed an additional lever for admission that looks beyond grades. So for some of our other programs where it was lower enrollment, we didn't want to do holistic admission. So in addition to the review that we were doing at the same time within the Faculty of Applied Sciences, which is one of our most competitive faculties, as engineering science and computing science are part of that faculty, we decided to do a holistic admissions with a brand new program that started at the same time called Sustainable Energy Engineering at our Surrey campus. And we decided to start with that program, which is quite a small program, with the intention that we were going to, or that we are going to scale up to our competitive engineering and computing science programs in the future. So for the C program, which is the abbreviation, it was a joint effort between the faculty and student services, which is where I didn't introduce my title. So I oversee, I'm the acting registrar and executive director of student enrollment. So my team in the registrar's office partnered with the faculty. And the goal was to diversify the student population. As many of you know, our engineering programs have a strong contingent of male students. So we wanted to see if we could diversify. And all applicants, so high school and college transfer, had to also submit a supplemental application reviewed by 2 readers, 1 faculty, 1 from student services, and would only go to a 3rd reader if there was a discrepancy between the 2 reads. And the supplemental questions that were created in consultation actually with ACRO, we worked very closely with Michelle and her team. You can see that focused on the below those 5 cognitive variables. Next slide, please. So some of the issues that we had is that the system that we use to manage and review the what we call the supplemental applications couldn't integrate with our student information system. We're a PeopleSoft school. So there is a lot of manual work going between PeopleSoft and our supplemental review system. And the big issue is that blind reads aren't possible in that system. So the student name and ID appear. And so as Dr. Sedlicek and Michelle talked about implicit bias that exists with names. And so we had to include that in the training as well. It is something that I'm currently working on with our IT department to get those names removed. We trust the readers to not use the student number and look up the file, but we do still have to mention that as well. As I mentioned, the C program is a small program, so enrollment is less than 100 students. So predicting scalability for larger enrollment programs like engineering, science, and computing is more challenging, but we are already anticipating scaling it up by creating a dedicated staff position. So initially we had 1 staff person who was an admission evaluator who was managing this process off the side of their desk. And I decided that we needed to have a dedicated staff person within the admissions office. So that is something you have to think about as well as the structures that you have in place within your organization. And the successes that we had, reader turnover has been very low. We saw a small increase in female enrollment. And the biggest thing is that the applicants appreciate being evaluated on more than just grades, and staff that aren't traditionally student facing, that are evaluating application files and maybe only interacting with students through answering phone calls that tend to be students who have been denied admission. It's a nice way for them to get a positive experience with students. So that's our experience at SFU. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Catherine. And so good to hear not only the benefits to the process and the results of being able to increase the diversity by gender, but also to hear that there are benefits to the students that they perceive and also the staff in a different way that they get to interact with the students than before. It's great. Thank you very much. In the words of Michael Palin, and now for something completely different, really nice to welcome in the University of Nebraska Medical Center, Dr. Kyle Meyer and Maggie Winicki, who are going to speak with us today about their programs. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom. It's really our pleasure to be here. I am the Dean of the College of Allied Health Professions, and Maggie is the Director of Enrollment Management and Student Affairs. So Tom, if you go to the next slide, this is just a very brief overview of our college. We are a public institution, part of a 4-campus system. University of Nebraska Medical Center is the health professions campus for our system. We have colleges of allied health, which we're representing, dentistry, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, and public health. Our college has 2 main campuses, one metropolitan, one rural, and the College of Allied Health encompasses about 13, it says here, we've added another program, but 14 different health profession programs. None of them begin at the freshman entry level, although we do have a couple of bachelor degree programs. So we have about 4,000 students across the campus, about 700 in our college. If you go to the next slide, Tom. So when we embarked on holistic review and holistic admissions, it certainly was our goal to increase the diversity of our student population, no question about it. But we wanted to have a very broad overarching set of goals for the college that would speak to the benefit of increasing diversity. So I'm not going to read these, but these were the ones that we came up with. And I want to draw your attention to one in particular: improve the learning experience for all students. So our objective was to get a diverse group of students in the broadest perspective with different views and different backgrounds and perspectives for the benefit of the whole. So Tom, I'll ask you to go on to the next one. We had several successes. I'm kind of a conceptual thinker, so these are defined or listed conceptually more or less for you, but from the Dean's office, we initiated holistic review as a strategic initiative and provided the funding to bring Michelle to our campus a few times and work with ACRO and do training. We had visits from the AAMC as we were investigating. So I thought it was an important piece that we demonstrated the value of this initiative by it not being an unfunded mandate. We have plenty of those, so we wanted to make sure that was clear. I shared with you the goals that we defined. We looked back in our history of admissions so that as we move forward, we could use a data-driven model. We did 2 things I think that were really interesting at our university. We asked, I use that term loosely, all 14 of our programs to participate. So we had a comprehensive implementation, and we took a very comprehensive view of all the processes that pertain to holistic review, and I'll share that with you in another diagram soon, which pertains to this next box. We found ourselves, we did some conceptual modeling to help people gain a shared mental model or a shared consciousness about what we were trying to achieve. And we didn't think at the outset that that was particularly earth-shattering, but it turned out to be a really helpful strategy for gaining shared mental model. Training, you've already mentioned, we did that. We held several strategies, several sessions of feedback for the stakeholders. And the one thing that we did prior to this, each of those individual programs that I mentioned had its own admissions committee. There are still, those committees still exist and make the eventual admission decisions, but we did not have a college-wide admissions committee that set policy and guided admissions, so we established that. And Tom, if you go to the next one, I'll share some of that quickly with you. One of the things that we asked that the college-wide admissions committee to do was to write their own mission statement. So they wrote an admissions mission statement. Here it is for you, reflecting the elements of holistic review. And this has been really helpful as we've come to decision points with the various programs to go back and ask if the policy, the decision is in fact in support of this collective mission. Next slide, Tom. This is what I was saying to you about the idea of thinking very holistically about holistic review. So as members of our faculty raised concerns or raised questions about the success of holistic review, we tried to address those. This conceptual model supports what we wrote in the upper right-hand corner, not simply an admissions practice, which is the big circle in the middle, but a mindset that permeates a continuum of activities. So we built support activity outcome measurements in each of those surrounding circles, with the idea that if we could be successful there in each of those, we would in fact promote the success of holistic review. Next slide, Tom, is another one of the conceptual models that we developed. So we asked people to think about how we were currently admitting students. So if you hit the first button, Tom, I think this probably won't show up in the slides. I think it shows up all at once because we didn't animate the slide deck that we sent you. That box number 2 is the box from where we take most of our students. Students with high metric scores and also high alignment with the mission of the institution. Tom, if you hit the next one. If we default, or at least historically, we tended to default favoring higher metrics and grades. That's box 1. And Tom, if you hit the last one, what we simply asked people to do is consider that what we were really trying to do is none of these individuals that we're looking at were below the minimum qualifications. We were asking by using non-cognitive variables in a holistic review. Tom spoke about this, Michelle spoke about it earlier. This is just a conceptual model to consider a mission alignment and non-cognitive variables and attributes in a higher rank or a higher value than metrics. Tom, if you go to the last one, I think it just outlines some of the challenges that we experienced as we adopted holistic review. I will say that virtually, there's a couple time and metrics in that purple box. But the majority of these things pertain to the culture of our campus and our college. Making sure that everybody was on the right page about the perceived value, addressing issues of unconscious bias. We spent a lot of time talking about the quality question, quotes, quality question in our programs. There was some concern that if we had implemented holistic review, that would be perceived as reducing the quality of our applicants. And we had to do a lot of evaluation of data to demonstrate not at all true. And then based on our individual programs, we had many programs that had historically had a view that in order to be one, fill in the blank, a physical therapist or a physician assistant, in order to pick one, you had to be one. So we were able, by virtue of this, by expanding our readers in non-cognitive variables and having more people on the admissions committee to demonstrate that certainly you need that expertise, but that there are a lot of individuals who, using a holistic review, can identify really strong candidates. I'll stop there, Tom. Thank you very much for the chance to visit with you.
Great. It's fantastic and so interesting to see this being applied in so many different environments. And last but certainly not least, we've got Virginia Tech. And so I'm really pleased to have Dr. Danette Gomez-Beans with us today, who's going to talk about their experience in implementing this in a very large public environment. Take it away.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for having us. We share a lot of the same successes and challenges that have already been addressed today. So I'm just going to focus on a couple things as we wrap up today's panel so we leave time for questions. So next slide. Virginia Tech is a comprehensive state institution. We have over 150 academic programs. And what we have learned in the enrollment management unit, which is where I am, I direct recruitment and operations, is what we learned over 2 decades was that we could see a very clear line in the sand of students that were admitted to Virginia Tech. And it was all based on GPA, SAT or ACT. And it was almost predictable. So counselors, families could really see that formula emerge over several cycles. When we employed Dr. Sedlicek and Michelle to come with ACRO to Virginia Tech to reassess our approach, we really dismantled all of that. These non-cognitive variables are now a humongous part of our review. And so what we used these for was to get to a pool that we understood to be more diverse and bring more breadth to our applicant pool. So you'll see that our president had set out for us to achieve a 40% representation of underrepresented, underserved students, first gen and veterans. And that was not the group that we had been identifying as admissible for a while. By using these non-cognitive variables, we were able to not only identify, but also assess in different areas beyond those basic matrices. So we did transform our process. We lowered as many barriers as we could. And what we created was what has been mentioned in other presentations today about that mission statement of the institution. Virginia Tech's motto is Ut Prosum, that I may serve. And so we felt that in order for these students to succeed in our culture, they must also feel this level of service. So we created what was called the Ut Prosum profile. And it was implementing in an essay form all of those characteristics Dr. Sedlicek mentioned at the beginning. So those top things that are indicators of success for students, for retention and for admission as well, were implemented into those questions. So we're excited that we had over 250 employees, and this year we also added alumni to be part of the reviewers of those essay questions and to tease out those qualities to ensure that the student was meeting those expectations of service. Next slide. So the challenges with that, because we do things at scale, were that we really needed to get trained over 200 readers in less than 6 weeks. And so we did. We put out a huge campus call and we had a great group show up. We got them trained in 6 weeks and they only had about 4 months to complete over 35,000 applicants reading. And that's with 2 readers. And as mentioned before, it'll kick to a 3rd reader if there's too much discrepancy between the scores. So really lots and lots of reading in 4 months, a very high level of commitment be around the campus, and we did achieve that. Next slide. The success is in the numbers. We saw in one cycle a market improvement in reaching those underrepresented students as part of the admission cycle. So you will see that our retention numbers went up, our applications went up, and our enrollment went up in all areas of strategic populations that we have been focusing on. I will tell you that this year, early indicators are showing an even bigger increase this year. We're in cycle 3 of this process. So we're tracking about 24% higher than last year. So again, the proof is in the pudding here, in that these non-cognitive variables really do make a difference for these students. And I think that's it. Yep. So I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm just going to stop the share here for just a minute because we want to have the ability to, first of all, thank you. Great presentations. We've got a couple minutes for questions here. And we had one that came through, which asked, and this is not surprising, how does this apply then to scholarships, and how do you use these methods in order to be able to award scholarships? So I'm not sure who would like to take it first. Maybe Michelle, do you want to share some experiences with that?
Yeah, I can kind of give an overview, and then if any of the institutions want to jump in. My experience in my past institution where this was implemented, oh my gosh, 18 years ago, is that right, Sid? Something like that. And the institutions I've worked with since being with ACRO, a lot of schools will keep their scholarship process separate and then watch and see how this goes. And if it goes well within the admissions process, I've seen a lot of schools where scholarship will jump on board pretty quickly. It reduces the workload for everyone, and they see a high quality coming out through the non-cognitive variable process. It also is really built a lot of relationships across campus by doing it. Plus it gets all of the information up front in the admissions process, so you have all the data to track. Do any of the other schools have exact experience with the scholarship piece?
Michelle, I'll say for UNMC, what we've looked at within the College of Allied Health Professions is trying to make sure that our scholarship process was holistic as well, so that it mirrored our enrollment goals. And so in looking at merit-based scholarships, we had to redefine what merit meant. So before, merit equaled academic metrics. And because we said for admissions, it no longer equaled that, it was important that for scholarships, it didn't either. And so we used our admission rankings that was based on a holistic approach to then also look at scholarship awards as well.
Right, right.
I have a comment, this is Sedlicek. It's very easy to get caught in the trap of saying, gee, we want to increase our students of color or any particular group. And so we'll just kind of throw some money at it and see what we do. But if you don't build in some additional attributes, if you don't just go after bodies, that you now have a way to not only defend why you're giving money to this person, but increasing the likelihood that you're placing your bets on people who might really be able to make it. So I think many programs aiming at diversity have failed because they just have a kind of a broad sweep without being specific. So here's a way not only to get the money to the right people, but be able to answer all your audiences who might say, why did this person get it and not this person?
It's fantastic. Thank you. And I know too from my past practice in higher education that when you are awarding scholarships, you want to make sure that that student is also going to engage with your community, so that you have you're not just having that expertise or excellence in the classroom, but you're also making sure that that person becomes part of that community. And if you don't ask about those type of things, you won't likely wind up with a group of students who will be part of that community as well, which is such an important part of achieving that. So great. I just want to ask, I'll ask our kind of backstage folks, were there any other questions that came up through the Q&A before we close it out?
One was asked in the answered column there. I don't know if you saw that one.
I did not.
It has a written answer from Catherine that's pretty
Oh.
specific, so that might serve well.
Okay, very good. Okay, good. So thank you, Catherine, for answering that. Very good. Wow. Okay. Examples of this. And then did you find that underserved applicants are able to answer supplemental questions sufficiently? So what's been your experience with that? Are they giving you enough information to be able to make a good evaluation? Who'd like to give an answer to that? How about Danette at Virginia Tech? I know you had a lot of folks from underserved populations who had gone through the holistic admissions process. Did you have any instances where you didn't have enough information to be able to evaluate it?
That's a great question. So because we limited our responses to 120 words, and that was by recommendation of Dr. Sedlicek, there were times where people were very limited in what they could share. So they would say things like, one of our questions is, how do you respond to discrimination? Were you witness or victim to it? And how'd you respond? That's hard to do in 120 words. And especially if you've lived your whole life as a marginalized community, in a marginalized community where you feel discrimination on a daily basis, right?
Well,
So there were some students who had the skills to do that, and that developmentally just couldn't get those words across. So agreed that it is difficult to get those teased out. But I do think that by begging the appropriate questions, by asking the right questions, we were able to get the information we needed and get an insight into their worldview.
This Sedlicek, I want to just add something to why I think a short-term answer is better. First of all, we find that many groups are not as verbal, particularly in writing, as we're used to the upper middle class white students who will write, endlessly about all sorts of things if you give them a chance. So a problem with many financial aid applications that people just go on and on and on about all kinds of things. So having people focus not only helps shorten their ability to say, we want to know just about this, but it allows a more fair assessment of people who aren't as wordy, let's say, as some others might be.
Excellent. Thank you. We are just about out of time, and I just want to close with a few things. I know we had some questions that were flowing in out there, but I want to encourage people to contact our authors and also read the book, right? Get the book. But we also at the ACRO have a COVID guidance page. Don't forget about that. We have a lot of resources out there coming out, not only our website, but through Transcript, Connect, et cetera. We also just have some new information coming out from research and Dr. Wendy Kilgore about the impact of COVID on practice. So please make sure and get on the research page and see the new research that's out there about not only practice, but also stress levels on practitioners and the impact of that, and probably the need for some self-care as we face this. Again, wonderful book, great authors. You can see there's a lot that we could have spent time on today with this, but We just had just some highlights of this, but please dive in that. But I also want to make sure you saw Ced's new book, second book here in this, and don't forget to go to your better bookstores online or otherwise and pick up that as well. We've got some additional upcoming coffee breaks. And so please make sure and get on our website if you'd like to register for those, just like you did for this one today. Click in and enjoy an additional coffee break with ACRO. We hope they're really helpful, informative, and a great way to spend the end of the week. If you are, and encourage just generally speaking, if you'd like to engage a little bit of our new webinar series, we know this is a stressful time and we really understand that people would like some resources just to help them de-stress a little bit or do some self-care. This is a new series. We really encourage you to get on our website and find out more information about these. So, and also if you do need any specific help, we mentioned several times these folks had ACRO come and help them. We'd be more than happy to speak with you about that. Please contact Nicole Spiro at ACRO Consulting. You've got the email address right there. So thank you so much. Mike, any last things that our participants need to know today?
Mike left us.
All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, folks. Just want to thank you for being on today. Wonderful job. And thanks for sharing your expertise. And we're looking so forward to really diving into the new book. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Have a
Thank
great
you.
week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.